They said a person who represents themselves in court has a fool for a client. But as Lisa Branch pushed open those heavy courtroom doors on a Tuesday morning in Harris County, Texas, clutching a battered leather briefcase that had seen better days, her ex-husband Michael Parton didn't see a fool. He saw prey. He leaned back in his custom Italian suit, whispered something to his attorney, and the sound that came out of his mouth was laughter. Cold, dismissive laughter that echoed through the marble halls of justice. To the world, Michael was the self-made tech genius, the $18 million man who built an empire from nothing. To him, Lisa was just the woman who used to answer his phones and balance his checkbooks. A footnote. A speed bump on his road to greatness. But when Lisa opened that briefcase and the first document hit the table, the laughter died. Because what she pulled out wasn't just paperwork. It was 12 years of truth, carefully preserved, meticulously documented, and about to burn his entire world to the ground. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How does a Jamaican immigrant with no law degree take down a man who's never lost anything in his life? Why would a husband systematically try to erase his wife's existence 6 months before filing for divorce? And what was inside that briefcase that made a 20-year veteran judge remove her glasses and whisper something the court reporter had to ask her to repeat? This is the story of Lisa Branch versus Michael Parton, and it's about to show you that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who kept all the receipts. The year was 2012, and there wasn't an $18 million valuation. There wasn't even a real office. There was just a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Northwest Houston, the constant hum of overheating servers in the bedroom closet, and a dream that Michael Parton sketched on a coffee-stained napkin while Lisa made dinner. Lisa had come to America from Kingston, Jamaica 7 years earlier with a degree in accounting from the University of the West Indies and exactly $2,000 in her pocket. She met Michael at a tech meetup where she was the only woman in a room of 40 men, and he was the guy in the back corner pitching an idea that everyone else had dismissed as impossible. Crosstech Solutions, he called it, a software platform that would revolutionize how small businesses manage their supply chains. Most people thought he was crazy. Lisa thought he was brilliant. They were married 6 months later in a simple ceremony at the courthouse. Just them and 2 witnesses, because neither had money for anything fancy. Michael was working at best by fixing computers, and Lisa was doing bookkeeping for 3 different small businesses, working 70-hour weeks to save every penny she could. When Michael came to her in late 2012 and said he was ready to quit his job and build Crosstech full-time, Lisa didn't hesitate. She liquidated her savings, $47,000 she'd been squirreling away since coming to America, money she'd planned to use for a house down payment someday, and she handed it all to him. Not as a loan, as an investment in their future. But here's what Michael's lawyers would later try to claim in court, that Lisa was just a supportive wife who gave her husband some money. That's not what happened. Lisa didn't just write a check and step back. She became the chief financial officer, the operations manager, the first employee, and the person who kept that company breathing when it should have died a dozen times over. She built the financial models that secured their first small business administration loan. She personally called 300 potential clients in their first year until her voice went hoarse. When Michael was in the back room coding until 3 in the morning, Lisa was in the living room managing the books, processing invoices, chasing payments, doing everything that actually keeps a business alive while the visionary gets to dream. And for the first 4 years it worked. They were partners in every sense of the word. Michael handled the technology, Lisa handled everything else, and Crosstech Solutions grew from that apartment closet to a small office, then to a real facility with 20 employees, and then to something that started attracting serious attention from investors. By 2016, they'd landed a contract with a major retail chain, and suddenly the company that started on a napkin was worth actual money. Lisa's name was on everything: the incorporation documents, the bank accounts, the small business administration loan applications where she was listed as co-founder and chief financial officer. She'd signed personal guarantees on their business credit lines. Her credit score had taken hits when they'd maxed out cards to make payroll in the early days. This wasn't Michael's company that Lisa helped with. This was their company, built together, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. But success does something to people, especially when it comes fast and feels like vindication after years of struggle. By 2017, Michael started talking differently about the company's origin story. In interviews with local business magazines, Lisa's name got mentioned less and less. The narrative became about the lone genius who risked everything, who built something from nothing through sheer will and brilliant coding. At company events, Michael would talk about the early days in the apartment, but somehow Lisa's role shrank from co-founder to supportive wife, from the person who funded the dream to the person who believed in him while he made it happen. She noticed, but she didn't push back, not at first. They were married, it was their money, their success, and she told herself that what mattered was that they were building something together, not who got credit in some magazine article that nobody would remember in 5 years. Then Michael hired what he called a professional management team, people with MBA degrees from fancy schools, people who wore expensive suits and used words like optimization and restructuring, people who definitely were not bookkeepers from Jamaica who learned business in the real world instead of a classroom. Lisa found herself in fewer meetings. Her title on the company website changed from co-founder to director of operations, and then a few months later to administrative manager. And then one day she checked and her photo wasn't on the leadership page at all. When she asked Michael about it over dinner one night, he didn't even look up from his phone.
The marketing team thought it looked more professional this way, he said, like he was talking about changing the font on their letterhead instead of erasing his wife from the company she'd built. It looks more streamlined, he said, more focused. Investors like a clear narrative, and the narrative is easier when it's just one founder. She should have known then. She should have seen what was coming. But you don't want to believe that the person you've shared a bed with for 10 years, the person you've sacrificed everything for, is capable of something that cruel. You tell yourself it's about business, not about you. You tell yourself that when you've been married this long, the distinction between mine and ours doesn't matter because you're a team. You tell yourself that until the morning a process server knocks on your door at 7 a.m. and hands you an envelope containing divorce papers and a settlement offer that values 12 years of your life at $50,000. It was a Thursday in March of 2018, and Lisa was still in her robe, coffee cup in hand, when the knock came. Michael had left for work early, something he'd been doing more and more, and she'd been enjoying the rare, quiet morning. The man at the door was professional and apologetic, the way process servers are when they've been doing the job long enough to know they're often delivering bombs into people's lives. She signed for the envelope, closed the door, and stood in the hallway reading words that didn't make sense. Petition for divorce. Irreconcilable differences. Division of assets. She had to read the settlement offer 3 times before her brain would accept what her eyes were seeing. Michael was offering her $50,000, a used Honda Civic that was already in her name, and the furniture from their apartment. In exchange, she would relinquish all claims to Crosstech Solutions, the company she'd founded with him, the company she'd poured her entire life savings into, the company that was now valued at $18 million according to the documents attached to the petition. $50,000. Less than what she'd invested in 2012, not accounting for inflation or the 6 years of 70-hour work weeks that followed. The letter from Michael's attorney, a man named John Kidwell from one of Houston's most expensive firms, explained that since Lisa had not been an executive or owner of record for the past 18 months, and since she had been primarily performing administrative duties, the court would likely view her as an employee rather than a founder. The letter suggested, in language that tried to sound generous, that $50,000 was actually quite fair considering she had no formal equity stake and that Michael had been gracious enough to allow her to draw a salary despite her limited contributions in recent years. Limited contributions. Those words burned. She read them over and over until they blurred. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to put down the coffee cup before she dropped it. Limited contributions. She'd given this man her entire life savings when he was nobody. She'd worked for free for 2 years before they could afford to pay her a salary. She'd personally guaranteed business loans that could have destroyed her credit for decades if the company had failed. She'd been listed as co-founder on their small business administration application because Michael needed her credentials and her capital to even qualify for the funding that kept them alive in year 3. And now that there was real money involved, now that the risk had paid off and the company was worth something, she had made limited contributions. The phone rang. It was Michael, and his voice had that careful, rehearsed quality that told her he'd been preparing for this conversation. "Look," he said, "I know this is hard, but we both know the marriage has been over for a while. We've grown apart, we want different things, and it's better to end this now before it gets ugly. The settlement is fair, Lisa. It's actually generous considering you haven't been actively involved in the company for over a year. You can take the money, start fresh, and we can both move on with our lives." "You haven't been actively involved?" she heard herself say, her voice sounding strange and distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Michael, I built that company with you, I funded it, I ran operations for 6 years. You're going to stand there and tell me I haven't been involved?" He sighed, the sound of a patient man dealing with an emotional woman who couldn't see reason. "You helped in the early days, and I appreciate that, but let's be honest, you're not equipped to run a company at this level. The investors, the board, they need people with real expertise, people who understand scaling and growth strategy. You're a bookkeeper, Lisa, and that's fine, but Crosstech has moved beyond bookkeeping. Take the settlement, it's a clean break, and you won't have to deal with lawyers and court dates and all that stress. Just sign the papers." She hung up on him. It was petty and accomplished nothing, but she hung up anyway because if she'd stayed on the line one more second, she would have started screaming or crying or both, and she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. For the next 3 days, Lisa barely left her apartment. She called in sick to work, which was ironic since her work was at Crosstech, and Michael was clearly hoping she'd just stop showing up. She read the divorce papers over and over, trying to find some angle she'd missed, some clause that acknowledged her actual contributions. There was nothing. In Michael's version of history, as told through legal documents drafted by attorneys who billed $800 an hour, Lisa was a supporting character in his success story, someone who'd been along for the ride and was now being fairly compensated for her time. On day 4, she got angry. Really angry, the kind of anger that burns cold and clear and focuses your mind like a laser. She opened her laptop and started searching. She didn't have money for an attorney. Michael had already frozen their joint accounts, something the divorce papers mentioned in passing as a necessary step to preserve marital assets during the proceedings. She had about $3,000 in her personal checking account, money from her salary that wouldn't even cover a retainer for the kind of lawyer she'd need to fight someone like John Kidwell. So if she couldn't afford to hire a lawyer, she'd have to become one, at least enough of one to file a response and force this to trial instead of just rolling over and accepting Michael's insult of an offer. The Harris County Law Library became her second home. She was there when they opened at 8 a.m. and stayed until they kicked her out at closing. She read everything she could find about Texas divorce law, community property, business valuation, and equitable division of assets. She learned that Texas is a community property state, which meant that anything acquired during the marriage, including businesses, was presumed to belong equally to both spouses unless proven otherwise. She learned about the concept of separate property versus community property and how the burden of proof was on the person claiming something was separate. She learned that courts could pierce corporate veils and look behind shell companies and offshore accounts when one spouse was trying to hide assets. And most importantly, she learned that she had a case, a real one, if she could prove her contributions and Michael's attempts to defraud her out of her share. But knowing you have a case and actually presenting it in court are two different things. Lisa had never stood in front of a judge in her life. She'd never cross-examined a witness or filed a motion or argued procedure. She was about to go up against John Kidwell, who'd been practicing family law for 25 years and had a reputation for absolutely destroying pro-SE litigants, people who represented themselves. He was expensive because he was good, and he was good because he was ruthless. Michael had hired him specifically because Kidwell didn't lose, especially not to amateurs. But Lisa had something that Kidwell didn't. She had the truth, and she had documentation, because when you're an accountant by training and a bookkeeper by trade, you keep records. Not just the records the IRS requires, but everything, every email, every contract, every bank statement, every invoice, every single piece of paper that crossed her desk in 12 years of building a company. She had the original Small Business Administration loan application from 2013 with both their signatures and her listed as co-founder and CFO. She had the articles of incorporation that named them both as directors. She had emails from investors addressed to both of them discussing equity stakes. She had bank records showing her $47,000 investment and years of salary deferrals when they couldn't make payroll. She had internal financial reports she'd prepared showing the company's growth, reports with her name on them as CFO, reports that had been submitted to banks and investors. She had text messages from Michael thanking her for saving the company during a cash crunch in 2015. She had everything, and she organized it the way only someone with her training could, chronologically, categorically, with an index and cross-references, and a timeline that told a story so clear that even a judge who'd never heard of cross-tech solutions would understand exactly what had happened. It took her 4 months to prepare her response to the divorce petition and her counterclaim for her share of the marital assets, working nights and weekends while still showing up to Crosstech during the day because she refused to quit and make Michael's narrative true. For months of surviving on 4 hours of sleep, of learning legal terminology and civil procedure, of drafting and redrafting until every word was precise. When she finally filed her response in July of 2018, it was 147 pages long, including exhibits, and it didn't ask for $50,000. It asked for 50% of everything: the company, the real estate Michael had bought using company funds, the vehicles, the investment accounts, everything, because that's what Texas law said she was entitled to, and that's what she'd earned. The first hearing was in September, a temporary orders hearing where the judge would decide things like who paid what bills and whether Lisa could keep working at Crosstech while the divorce was pending. John Kidwell showed up with 2 associates and a paralegal, a show of force designed to intimidate. Michael sat at the defendant's table in a suit that probably cost more than Lisa's car, looking confident and slightly bored, like this was an annoying formality he had to endure before getting back to important things. Lisa sat alone at the plaintiff's table with her briefcase and a legal pad, and she could feel the eyes on her. The bailiff, the court reporter, the handful of people in the gallery who'd wandered in because they had nothing better to do. She could hear the whispers look at her, representing herself. She has no idea what she's doing. This is going to be a massacre. Judge Sharon Gaines took the bench at exactly 9 a.m., a black woman in her 50s with 23 years on the Harris County bench and a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from anyone. She looked at Lisa, looked at the army of lawyers across the aisle, and something flickered in her expression that might have been sympathy or might have been irritation. "Ms. Branch," Judge Gaines said, "you understand you have the right to hire an attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lisa said, standing up the way she'd seen lawyers do in the courtroom videos she'd watched online. "I can't afford an attorney, so I'm representing myself." The judge nodded slowly. "And do you understand that Mr. Kidwell is a very experienced attorney and that you're at a significant disadvantage proceeding without counsel?" "I understand, Your Honor," Lisa said, "but I also understand that I have a right to present my case, and I intend to do that to the best of my ability." Judge Gaines studied her for a long moment, and then something in her face softened just slightly. "All right then," she said, "we'll proceed. Mr. Kidwell, I assume you have some motions for the court?" Kidwell stood up with the casual confidence of a man who'd won before he'd even walked into the room, and he spent the next 20 minutes arguing why Lisa should be removed from Crosstech immediately, how her presence at the company was disruptive, and how Michael needed to protect his business interests during the divorce proceedings. He called her a disgruntled employee who was using the divorce as leverage to extract money from a company she had no real stake in. He painted a picture of Michael as the victim, a successful entrepreneur being held hostage by a vindictive ex-wife who couldn't accept that the marriage was over. And then it was Lisa's turn, and she stood up with her hands shaking but her voice steady, and she said, "Your Honor, may I approach?" Judge Gaines nodded, and Lisa walked forward with a folder containing 3 documents, the Small Business Administration loan application, the original articles of incorporation, and a bank statement showing her $47,000 wire transfer. "I'd like to submit these as exhibits," she said, handing copies to the judge and to Kidwell, who took them with barely concealed irritation. Judge Gaines put on her reading glasses and looked at the first document, the SBA application, and Lisa watched her eyes move across the page, taking in the names, the signatures, the box where Lisa was identified as co-founder and chief financial officer. "Your Honor," Lisa said, "Mr. Kidwell just called me a disgruntled employee. These documents show that I was never an employee. I was a founder. I was the person who funded this company with my life savings, and I was the chief financial officer for 6 years. The company exists because I made it exist, and Mr. Parton's attempt to rewrite that history doesn't change the facts. I'm not asking the court to remove me from the company. I'm asking the court to prevent my husband from removing me from the company I helped build while we sort out who owns what." Judge Gaines looked up from the documents and fixed her gaze on Kidwell, and her tone was considerably less warm than it had been a moment before. "Mr. Kidwell," she said, "your client represented to this court that Ms. Branch was an employee. Is that correct?" "That's our position, Your Honor," Kidwell said, still confident, but with a slight edge in his voice now. "Ms. Branch may have performed some administrative functions in the company's early days, but she was never a true founder or equity holder, and these documents don't prove otherwise. They're loan applications and incorporation papers, standard forms that often include spouses for various legal and financial reasons. They don't establish that Ms. Branch had any meaningful operational role or ownership interest." Judge Gaines held up the SBA application and tapped it with her finger. "Mr. Kidwell," she said, "your client signed a federal document under penalty of perjury identifying Ms. Branch as a co-founder and CFO. Are you arguing that he committed fraud on the federal government? Because if Ms. Branch wasn't actually a founder, then this application was false, and that's a serious allegation." The temperature in the courtroom dropped about 20 degrees, and Kidwell's confidence flickered for the first time. "Your Honor," he said, "I'm not suggesting fraud. I'm suggesting that the business relationship evolved over time and that titles on old paperwork don't reflect the current reality of who built and runs Crosstech Solutions. The current reality," Judge Gaines said, her voice sharp now, "is that this court needs to determine what the actual reality was during the marriage, not what Mr. Parton's convenient narrative is today. Ms. Branch will remain employed at Crosstech. She will have access to company records as she's entitled to during discovery, and Mr. Parton will not take any action to diminish the value of marital assets while this case is pending. We'll reconvene for a full hearing in 90 days. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the room, and Lisa felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, just a flicker of it, but real. She'd survived the first round, and more than that, she'd landed a hit. Michael didn't look at her as he stood up and walked out of the courtroom with his legal team trailing behind him, but she could see it in the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. He'd expected her to fold, to take his offer and disappear, and she hadn't. Now, he knew this was going to be a fight. Over the next 3 months, Lisa lived in a constant state of controlled chaos, working at Crosstech during the day while Michael pretended she didn't exist, spending her evenings preparing for trial, and using every spare moment to document everything that might matter. Discovery in a divorce case is supposed to be a mutual process where both sides exchange information, but Michael's team turned it into warfare. They buried her in requests for documents, hundreds of interrogatories asking for details about every day of her life for the past 12 years, demands that would have taken a team of paralegals weeks to fulfill. They were trying to drown her in paperwork, to make the process so exhausting and overwhelming that she'd give up and take a settlement just to make it stop. But they'd miscalculated, because Lisa was an accountant, and accountants don't get overwhelmed by paperwork, they get organized. She created spreadsheets to track every discovery request, every deadline, every document she needed to produce. She worked methodically through their demands, producing thousands of pages of records that proved exactly what she'd been saying all along, that she'd been integral to Crosstech from day one, that she'd made financial decisions, signed contracts, managed operations, done everything that a co-founder and CFO does. And then she started making her own discovery requests, and that's when things got interesting because Michael didn't want to produce documents. His attorneys filed motion after motion trying to block her requests, claiming they were overbroad, irrelevant, harassing. They argued that company financial records were proprietary business information that couldn't be disclosed even in divorce proceedings. They fought her on everything, every single document she requested, and their resistance told her something important. They were hiding something. In late November, 2 months before trial, Lisa's request for Crosstech's corporate bank statements finally got approved over Kidwell's objections, and when she sat down with 6 years of statements spread across her kitchen table, she found it. Buried in the records from 2017, 8 months before Michael filed for divorce, were wire transfers to a company she'd never heard of, Parton Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware. Over the course of 6 months, Michael had transferred almost $2 million from Crosstech to this shell company, money that he'd classified as consulting fees in the books, but that had no corresponding services, no invoices, no documentation of any actual work performed. He'd been siphoning money out of their company and hiding it in an entity that wasn't listed in his divorce disclosures, money that should have been split 50-50 as a marital asset, but that he'd tried to move out of reach before filing the petition. It was fraud, clear and simple, and Lisa knew it was the smoking gun she needed. She filed an emergency motion with the court asking for an order to freeze Parton Holdings and demanding a full accounting of where the money had gone. Kidwell's response was immediate and aggressive, claiming that Parton Holdings was Michael's separate property business that had existed before the marriage, which was a lie, and that Lisa had no right to access records from a company she wasn't part of. But Judge Gaines had seen enough by this point, and when they appeared for a hearing on Lisa's motion in early December, the judge wasn't interested in Kidwell's explanations.